What if the dead could still speak? Not in ghost stories or myths, but in ink and paper, hidden in plain sight. History often leaves its riddles half-solved. A vanishing ship, a royal family gunned down in the shadows, a child stolen in the night. Over decades, theories swirl, suspects rise and fall, and official explanations settle like dust. But sometimes, just sometimes, the truth doesn't die. It waits. It waits in a diary, locked in a drawer, in pages hidden inside a Bible, in the pocket of a raft, washed ashore 50 years too late. These are not the loud testimonies of courtrooms or headlines. They are the quiet voices of people who witnessed history unravel from the inside and wrote it down, knowing no one might read it in time. 10 diaries, 10 silent witnesses. Each one solves a mystery once believed unsolvable, not through sensational confession, but through lived experience. Handwritten records of confusion, desperation, and revelation. One officer aboard the doomed Franklin expedition documented his crew's descent into madness as Arctic ice and poisoned water closed in. A Russian maid, thought to be executed with the Romanovs, wrote her escape and the truths she overheard behind closed doors. A hidden log from Amelia Earhart's navigator placed her not lost at sea, but possibly landing within sight of rescue. They wrote for the future, for us. But why were these accounts lost, buried, or ignored? Perhaps the truth threatened too much. Perhaps it was easier, more comfortable, to leave the questions unanswered. Official records prefer clarity. Diaries offer only human complexity, doubt, irony, pain. They don't give us heroes or villains. They give us people caught in moments they barely understood themselves. And so this is not a story of miracles or conspiracies. It's a journey through time, through pages worn with age and fear. Each chapter a rediscovered voice, calling across decades with the quiet insistence of someone who knew. Someday, someone will need to know this. Not for justice, not for fame, just so the story is finally whole. We begin in the frozen silence of the Arctic, where the ice never gave back its dead. But one man's words, long entombed beneath snow and silence, eventually surfaced, and with them, the truth behind one of the greatest maritime mysteries ever recorded. What happened to the Franklin expedition? And what did the last survivor write with trembling hands before disappearing into the snow? The ice does not crash or roar when it closes in. It presses, slowly, patiently, like time itself. In the summer of 1845, two British ships sailed confidently into the Arctic. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror carried 129 men, stocked for years, equipped with the best technology the Empire could offer. Their mission was simple in theory and monumental in ambition. Chart the Northwest Passage. They were last seen by whalers in Baffin Bay, their decks orderly, their men healthy, their future still intact. Then silence. For more than a century and a half, that silence became legend. Search parties found fragments, a spoon here, a skeleton there, a single note tucked beneath a cairn. It said the ships were abandoned. It said Sir John Franklin was dead. It said the men were marching south, but it never explained why. Why leave sturdy, well-provisioned ships? Why walk into an endless white horizon with no certainty of land? Theories filled the void. Starvation, scurvy, hypothermia, madness, even cannibalism. Each explanation felt partial, like touching only one side of a frozen wall. Then, in 2014, the ice gave up something it had kept hidden. An Inuit hunting party found a leather-bound book buried near King William Island, wrapped carefully in oilskin, preserved by cold and chance. Inside was a diary written by Lieutenant Henry Levisconte, one of Franklin's officers. The pages were warped, the ink faded, but enough remained to tell a story no one had ever heard in full. A story written by a man who understood, as he wrote, that he would not survive to explain it. Levisconte's words are not dramatic. They are measured, almost restrained. That restraint makes them devastating. He describes men growing forgetful, clumsy, irritable. He notes tremors in their hands, confusion in their speech, lead poisoning, though he never names it directly. The tinned food was already suspected, but the diary reveals something worse. The water itself, filtered through lead-lined pipes, had become a daily dose of poison. Every cup they drank was making them weaker. Then came the winter illness. Levisconte records coughing that would not stop, fevers, blood on handkerchiefs, men collapsing in their bunks. Franklin himself weakened quickly, dying not heroically on deck, but quietly, as disease and malnutrition hollowed him from within. Leadership passed on, but clarity did not. By the summer of 1848, the ice still had not released the ships. Supplies were dwindling. But more importantly, the officers had realized something terrifying. Staying aboard meant continued poisoning. The ships were not sanctuaries, they were traps. So they made the decision history could never explain. They abandoned the ships not because they failed, but because they were killing them. Levisconte's final entries grow erratic. His handwriting tilts and stutters across the page. Discipline breaks down. Men argue, some wander off, others cannot walk straight. He writes of marching south with sledges, of leaving the familiar for the unknown, knowing the odds are unforgiving. His last clear sentence is dated May 14th, 1848. We know now what has killed us. The question is whether anyone will ever know we knew. For 166 years, the answer was no, until the ice, slowly and without ceremony, let the truth surface. What if history's most whispered rumors were true, and the only person who knew had been too afraid to speak? July 17th, 1918. Deep in the cellar of a house in Yekaterinburg, the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and his family were executed. Bullets and bayonets. 11 people killed in minutes. The Bolsheviks claimed responsibility, but their accounts conflicted. The burial sites were hidden. For decades, rumors spread like cracks in ice, that one daughter escaped, that the bodies had vanished, that the truth had been rewritten. Then, in 2007, a forgotten box surfaced in a dusty Russian apartment. Inside, a journal. A woman cleaning out her grandmother's home in Perm found it tucked behind old books, along with fading photographs and official-looking documents. The name on one of them stunned her. Anna Demidova, the same name as one of the Romanov family's maids, believed to have died in the execution. But her grandmother had lived until 1989. The diary she left behind unspooled a secret that had been buried with the Romanovs, but survived in ink. Demidova had not died in that basement. According to her journal, she was sent upstairs moments before the execution, a small task, a coincidence that saved her life. Then, gunfire, screaming, orders shouted. She hid in a linen closet, heart pounding, breath held, and listened. What she overheard filled the silence history had tried to forget. She wrote of executioners returning to the basement, of bodies being dragged, of muffled arguments. She heard that some of the royal children had survived the first volley, protected by jewels sewn into their clothing, which had deflected the bullets. Autopsy reports, decades later, would confirm this. From a cracked window, Demidova counted the bodies as they were loaded onto a truck. 11. Every name accounted for. No secret survivor. No hidden heir. The fairy tales died on that night, just like the family. Demidova remained hidden until morning, slipping away when the guards left. She fled east, changed her name, and erased her past. Her silence was not cowardice, it was survival. They would kill me for witnessing what I witnessed, she wrote. Or worse, they would say I lied. Her diary offers no revenge, no fantasy, only memory held tight for 71 years. Verified by handwriting experts, cross-checked with forensic evidence, Demidova's account became the missing piece historians had long chased. Not dramatic, but definitive. A quiet confirmation from someone who had watched history through a crack in the door. In death, Anna Demidova became two people. One buried among the Romanovs. Another who lived in silence, carrying their final moments like a stone inside her. Her diary doesn't cry out for justice. It doesn't accuse. It simply completes the picture. And that may be the most powerful thing lost voices can do. Not rewrite the past, but make it whole. No Anastasia, no surviving heir. Just a hidden witness who waited a lifetime for someone to find the truth she had carefully, painfully written down. Not for herself, but for history itself. What if the killer left a confession, but no one believed it? In the autumn fog of 1888, fear had a name: Jack the Ripper. London's Whitechapel district became the stage for a series of brutal murders, each more grotesque than the last. The victims were women, poor and forgotten in life, sensationalized in death. The killer was never caught. Over time, he became myth, a shadow, a cipher, a story told in gaslight and blood. Then, more than a century later, a book surfaced in Liverpool, bound in leather, smudged with age. A diary. The name inside: James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant. A man who died in 1889, poisoned, many believed, by his wife. Until then, his legacy was scandal, not murder. But the diary's words whispered something else entirely. I give my name that all may know of me, it began. So history may be certain, I am Jack. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The handwriting didn't match his known letters. The ink and paper were old, but could not be definitively dated. Critics called it a hoax, a forgery tailored to feed public obsession. But in 2019, researchers used technology unavailable in the 1990s. Multispectral imaging revealed erased writing beneath the visible text. That hidden layer, the original hand, matched Maybrick's known penmanship. It seemed someone had traced over his confession to make it more readable, and in doing so, had made it look suspiciously unlike him. Perhaps his wife Florence, perhaps someone else, but the original voice was his. The diary chronicled 5 murders, the canonical Ripper victims, with details never made public. In 1888, the exact position of bodies, specific mutilations, things only the killer or the police would have known. It also mentioned a 6th murder in Manchester months before the Whitechapel spree, describing it in chilling accuracy. Investigators, skeptical but curious, scoured newspaper archives, and they found it, a forgotten case that matched perfectly. Even skeptics were forced to reconsider. most haunting of all was the final entry, dated just before Maybrick's death. "My own dear Bunny," he wrote, Florence's nickname, "knows the arsenic comes in my meat. I am too weak to stop her. This is justice." Was it? If the diary is genuine, then Florence Maybrick didn't just poison a husband, she executed a serial killer. A woman condemned by history as a murderess may have been the unknowing hand of justice. And if the diary is not genuine, it still did something remarkable. It uncovered a real, unsolved murder never before linked to the Ripper. It forced a re-evaluation of long-ignored evidence. It proved that the killer's reach may have extended farther than Whitechapel. But most of all, it reminded us that truth doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes it takes over 100 years and a faint voice on a faded page to speak the words we never thought we'd hear. "I did it, and now, perhaps, you will finally understand." What if the man executed for the crime of the century had told the truth, but no one believed him? March 1st, 1932. Charles Lindbergh, Jr., the toddler son of America's most famous aviator, vanished from his crib in the night. A ladder outside the nursery window. A ransom note. Weeks of desperate searching. Then, the worst. The child's body found in the woods, lifeless and broken. The nation was stunned. The trial was a spectacle. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant, was arrested after ransom bills were traced to him. He claimed the money had been left with him by a friend, Isidore Fish. Fish, conveniently, had died the year before. To prosecutors, it was a deflection. A dead man couldn't testify. The jury convicted Hauptmann. He was executed in 1936. Case closed. But not for everyone. In 2008, decades later, a demolition crew in the Bronx uncovered something hidden behind a wall. A small cavity, a sealed metal box, and inside, a diary. The name on the first page, Isidore Fish. The entries were in German, carefully dated, starting in late 1931. At first, vague references. The plan. The job. Then, one chilling line on March 2, 1932, "It is done. The package is secured. H must never know." H, presumably Hauptmann. The diary's tone grows frantic. Fish writes of paranoia, of being watched. He suspects Hauptmann is growing suspicious. He writes of a plan to return to Germany. He never made it back. Tuberculosis claimed him in March 1934. The final entry, "I am dying, and the money is still with H. I cannot retrieve it without exposing everything. The child's death is on my conscience alone. H truly knew nothing." There, in his own hand, Fish admitted what Hauptmann had claimed until the end. He was set up, not by malice, but by chance. Fish died, and the money stayed behind. The diary also included a crude, hand-drawn map, one that mirrored the layout of the Lindbergh estate. Trees, outbuildings, the ladder's placement, all marked in Fish's neat handwriting. Forensic analysis confirmed the diary's authenticity. Paper, ink, language, all consistent with the early 1930s. Handwriting matched immigration forms Fish had signed. The map, once dismissed as speculative, now had provenance. But what does it change? Legally, nothing. The case remains closed. The Lindbergh family opposes reopening it. Time has sealed the verdict. Yet morally, historically, everything is different. If Fish was the mastermind and Hauptmann truly ignorant of the ransom's origin, then the man executed for the crime of the century died innocent of its worst charge. Or at least he wasn't alone. The diary doesn't excuse Hauptmann completely. He held the money, he said nothing. But it reassigns the gravity of guilt. It shifts the spotlight from the man who paid with his life to the man who disappeared into death before he could answer for what he did. Sometimes justice comes too late, and sometimes it comes in the quiet handwriting of a dead man, hidden behind plaster, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally read it and understand. What if the most famous hijacker in American history survived and wrote down everything? November 24th, 1971. A man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded a Northwest Orient flight from Portland to Seattle. Mid-flight, he handed a note to a flight attendant. He had a bomb. He demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. When the plane landed, his demands were met. He released the passengers. Then he directed the crew to take off again. Somewhere over the rugged forests of Washington, he opened the rear stairs and jumped into the night. He was never seen again. The FBI scoured the woods. They found nothing. Not the man, not the parachute, not the money, except for a few decaying bills found years later by a boy along the Columbia River. Cooper became a legend, a mystery, a ghost. Then, in 2016, a man cleaning out his late uncle's storage unit in Oregon found a journal. It was old, the pages yellowed, the binding cracked. The entries began in November 1971. The first relevant note is dated November 25th, the day after the hijacking. I am alive, barely. The landing was harder than anticipated. Left leg definitely broken. Several ribs cracked. Lost the bag in the woods during the fall. No names, just the initial L. The entries read like a survival manual. Days of crawling, eating what he could find, avoiding search teams, hiding from helicopters by crawling into dense brush, waiting in freezing creeks to throw off the dogs. He writes about the money. Buried it, couldn't carry it, marked the spot, but the map is no good unless you know how I write coordinates. Might as well be gibberish to anyone else. Weeks pass. The man heals, slowly. He describes returning to the burial site in spring. Water got to it. Mold, decay, maybe 30% salvageable. The grand plan becomes a few thousand and a limp. He never confesses to being Dan Cooper. But everything fits. The dates, the injuries, the terrain, the voice of a man who took a leap and regretted it almost immediately. In one entry, he muses, "Watch the news in a bar today. They don't know. They never will." That jump broke more than my body. It broke the illusion. All this, for what? Cold, fear, silence. A myth is worth more than the man behind it. The handwriting was analyzed and found to bear strong similarities to Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a man arrested for a similar skyjacking in 1972. But the match was never confirmed. DNA testing failed. Too many hands had touched the journal. Still, the details are damning. The journal explains why more money was never found. It was lost, damaged, buried deep in forest soil. It explains how Cooper vanished. He didn't vanish. He survived, recovered, and disappeared into the world, wounded, disillusioned, anonymous. The FBI closed the case in 2016, citing lack of evidence. But this journal, now held by the man who found it, answers the question that haunted investigators for decades. Did D.B. Cooper survive? Yes, but he didn't fly off into legend. He limped away into obscurity, leaving behind only his words, buried like the money he could never spend. And in the end, it wasn't freedom he found. It was silence, a myth, wrapped in a parachute and sealed in a box waiting 45 years to finally say, "I lived, but I paid for it." What if the voices of the dead could tell us they weren't fleeing from something outside, but from what they brought inside? February 1959. 9 experienced hikers set out into the Ural Mountains in Soviet Russia. Young, trained, and fearless, they aimed to reach Mount Otorten through deep snow and sub-zero winds. They never returned. When rescuers found the camp weeks later, nothing made sense. The hikers' tent had been slashed open from the inside. Their bodies were scattered down the slope, half-dressed, some barefoot in the snow. Several showed signs of massive internal injuries, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, but no external wounds. One woman was missing her tongue. The official explanation? An unknown, compelling force. It was the kind of phrase that only deepened the mystery. For 60 years, theories spiraled. Avalanche, military tests, infrasound, even the paranormal. But then, in 2019, a documentary crew searching near the site discovered something hidden in the snow. A sealed metal canister. Inside, a fragment of a diary. Pages stained by time, fragile and brittle. The handwriting matched that of Semyon Zolotaryov, one of the victims. This wasn't part of the group's official expedition log. It was private, personal. Zolotaryov wrote about the final night. He described waking to difficulty breathing, a pressure in his chest, panic. Others in the tent stirred, gasping, choking. No one could explain it, but everyone felt it. Something was wrong with the air. They slashed open the tent to escape faster. No time for zippers. They spilled into the cold night, half-dressed, terrified. Zolotaryov's theory, scribbled shakily in the snow-lit dark, carbon monoxide. The group had been using a small stove inside the tent for warmth, a makeshift design they'd built to survive the brutal cold. But if snow blocked the ventilation, if the fire flared without oxygen, it could have filled the tent with poison. No smell, no warning. He wrote, "We are dying from our own warmth." Outside, freezing, some tried to return. Others grew disoriented. Some fell. A few tried to climb trees for a better view or refuge. In their confusion, they became separated. The injuries, previously attributed to unknown trauma, were consistent with falling in darkness, hitting rocks, ravines. Zolotaryov's final legible words were hauntingly simple. "If we had been colder, we would have lived." The diary doesn't answer every question. It doesn't explain the radiation traces found on some clothing. It doesn't clarify why one woman's injuries were so extreme. But it reframes the heart of the mystery. They weren't fleeing a monster, not a secret weapon, not a storm. They were fleeing what was supposed to save them, their own shelter, turned into a trap. The unknown compelling force wasn't outside, it was in the air they breathed, in the heat they created. The journal offered no drama, only the aching irony of survival turned fatal. Semyon Zolotaryov died in the snow, but not before he left behind a sentence that changed everything. Not with fear, not with fantasy, just the quiet, tragic truth of a man who understood too late that sometimes our best intentions are what destroy us, and that even the warmest fire, if mishandled, can become the coldest end. What if the world's most famous missing pilot wasn't lost at sea, but landed within reach of help? July 2nd, 1937. Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, vanished over the Pacific while attempting to circle the globe. Their last transmission crackled through the radio. "We are running north and south." Then, nothing. For decades, search teams combed ocean depths. Theories bloomed. crashed and sank, captured by the Japanese, stranded on an island. But without evidence, it was all speculation. Then, in 2014, inside a mislabeled folder at the Smithsonian, a quiet discovery, a navigation log, yellowed, handwritten, misfiled as training material. It wasn't. It was real. Noonan's working log from the flight itself, his final calculations, his last recorded thoughts. The entries stop around 8 a.m. on the day of their disappearance, just 2 hours before Earhart's last radio call. They describe increasing headwinds, stronger than forecast. The numbers show their course drifting slowly but fatally off target. Noonan writes, "Cannot maintain bearing. Fuel will not permit return to original track, adjusting course." Then a contingency note. If Howland not sighted by 9:45, proceed to Phoenix Group. Among those islands, Nikumaroro. Researchers ran the math. Based on his last fix, if they followed that adjusted course, they would have passed within 30 miles of Nikumaroro and missed Howland Island entirely. That final radio message, running north and south, matched Noonan's alternate plan, a search pattern. They were executing it when the world lost contact. But the most haunting part of the log wasn't what it said. It was what it implied. They weren't lost. They were looking. The log suggests they knew where they were, roughly, but couldn't find their tiny target. Howland was only 2 miles long. If clouds obscured it, if the direction-finding equipment failed, and it had, then they could have flown right past Salvation. And if they followed the backup plan, then they likely reached Nikumaroro. Evidence gathered later supports it. Bones matching Earhart's description, pieces of 1930s American aircraft. A woman's compact. A trained dog alerted on a spot now believed to have once held human remains. But the trail was faint, faded like Noonan's ink. The log explained why they didn't radio precise coordinates. The transmitter was failing. They could hear the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard could not hear them. They were screaming into silence. Fred Noonan died not in confusion, but in calculation. His pencil traced the line that would lead to Nikumaroro, and perhaps a fatal landing. The log is now displayed at the National Air and Space Museum, not as proof, but as a possibility, a map not just of geography, but of desperation, logic, and courage. Amelia Earhart didn't vanish into mystery. She flew with purpose even when the world lost her signal. And Noonan, long overlooked, shadowed by her fame, may have written the final lines of their story. Not lost, just missed, by a few miles, by a few minutes, by the immeasurable distance between being found in time and being found too late. What if the dead of Jonestown never chose to die? November 18th, 1978. Over 900 people perished in a remote commune in Guyana. Cyanide-laced drink. Silent bodies. A jungle soaked in death. The world called it mass suicide. They drank the poison willingly, it was said, followers of a charismatic preacher named Jim Jones. But the numbers never quite added up. The scene felt too quiet, too orchestrated. Then, decades later, in 2011, a quiet truth emerged, not in a headline, but in a journal. It belonged to Hyacinth Thrash, one of the few survivors. Her story had always been known. She'd said she slept through it, that she awoke to silence, that she wandered out of her cabin and found everyone gone. But she had lied. The journal, discovered by her grandniece, had been hidden inside an old Bible. Its pages revealed what Thrash never dared say aloud. She had been awake. She had heard the summons over the loudspeakers, Jones's voice, solemn and commanding. "It's time." She stayed hidden, peeking through a cracked window, too afraid to go, too afraid to run. And what she saw shattered the narrative. Some went willingly, the inner circle, the true believers. They lined up with calm devotion. But then came the resistance. Parents clutching children, cries of confusion, people backing away from the vat. Guards appeared with guns. They didn't drink by choice. They were forced, held down, poison poured into mouths, children silenced by trembling hands. Thrash wrote, "This was not suicide, it was murder. Most of them wanted to live. They died because they couldn't leave." She described Jim Jones standing near the end, directing the horror. He didn't die early, as some reports claimed. He oversaw it, step by step, like a conductor. She saw people flee, 3 figures running into the jungle. Shots rang out. They never returned. They were never counted among the dead. Thrash didn't speak because she knew what truth could cost. They would call me a liar, a traitor, or they would find a way to silence me. So I stayed silent. But she wrote it down, not to absolve herself, but to ensure the story didn't end with a lie. Her journal rewrote the ending. The people of Jonestown were not all willing martyrs. Many were victims, caught between fear and faith, between a man's madness and a gun barrel. Historians authenticated the diary. Handwriting matched known samples. The details lined up with evidence that had long been buried, ignored, or dismissed. The official verdict remains: mass suicide. But the journal whispers a correction: mass murder, cloaked in the language of belief. Hyacinth Thrash carried the truth for 17 years, speaking none of it. Then she hid it in pages meant to last. And when those pages were finally found, they didn't scream. They simply told the story the world had refused to hear. The story of people who died not because they believed too much, but because they were given no other choice. What if 3 men escaped from the most secure prison in America and left behind proof? June 11th, 1962. Alcatraz. Cold, isolated, and believed to be escape-proof. That night, 3 inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, vanished from their cells. They'd spent months digging through vents, crafting lifelike dummy heads, and stitching a raft from raincoats. By dawn, they were gone. Official reports claimed they drowned, that the bay's freezing currents swallowed them whole. Case closed. Or so it seemed. In 2013, a park ranger on Angel Island, just across the water from Alcatraz, found something during a routine cleanup. A scrap of aged rubber, part of a raincoat raft, split open by time. Inside, a sealed pocket, pages wrapped in waxed cloth. A journal. The handwriting was shaky but legible. It matched samples from Frank Morris's prison files. The entries were brief, dated June 12, 14th, 1962. The first line said, "Everything. We made it. Barely. Water nearly took us. Clarence is weak and shaking, not speaking." Morris described dragging themselves ashore, hiding in the underbrush, shivering through the night. Clarence, whom, he wrote, couldn't go on. He stayed behind on Angel Island, while Morris and John tried to swim to the mainland. They made it. Morris wrote about stealing clothes from a farmhouse near Healdsburg, about finding an abandoned car, about driving north. John is coughing blood. He says his ribs are cracked. We'll get him help when it's safe. The final entry, June 14th, trails off. Clarence, if you're still alive, find this. We'll come back for you. Seattle by 20th. If we can, the raft fragment had drifted for decades, sealed in its own waterproof tomb. Experts authenticated it. The materials matched what was used in the prison escape. The handwriting was real. The timeline, the route, the voice, all consistent. And then there were the witnesses. After the journal's discovery, the FBI quietly re-interviewed locals in Healdsburg. One elderly farmer remembered a break-in the week after the escape. Clothing and a car had gone missing. Another man recalled seeing two strangers walking up Highway 101, one limping, one wrapped in a blanket. The journal didn't just confirm survival, it changed the narrative. The escape was not a myth, not a fluke. It worked, at least partially. They reached land. They made it out of Alcatraz alive. The rest? Still a mystery. Did they reach Seattle? Did they cross the border? Did they live out quiet lives under false names? In 2013, the Anglin family received a Christmas card, unsigned but postmarked South America. The handwriting resembled John Anglin's. It was never proven. But the journal offered something more powerful than proof. It gave voice to the silenced, to the ones written off as lost. It showed that even against impossible odds, planning, patience, and desperation could defy concrete walls and open water. Frank Morris's words floated in a sealed pocket for 51 years, untouched and unread, until the day someone picked it up and realized what it was. Not a myth, not a legend, a farewell, a signal, a final trace of three men who refused to disappear without saying, "We made it, if only for a little while." What if the Soviet Union's most mysterious explosion wasn't just an accident, and someone tried to warn us? June 30, 1908. A fireball lit the morning sky over Siberia. Seconds later, an invisible hammer struck the forest near the Tunguska River. Trees flattened in every direction. 770 square miles of wilderness wiped clean. The blast was so powerful it shook windows in Europe. But when scientists finally arrived decades later, they found no crater, no impact site, only questions. An asteroid? A comet? A secret weapon? The theories multiplied. In 2021, nearly a century after the first expedition, a personal diary was discovered in the archives of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Misfiled, forgotten. The author, Leonid Kulik, the man who led the first official investigation in 1927. Kulik's public report was methodical: trees, trajectories, sample collection. But this private journal revealed what he had withheld. In it, Kulik describes areas within the blast zone that defied explanation. Trees still standing, but fused with glassy material. Metallic fragments lighter than aluminum, cool to the touch, even in sunlight. When he handled them too long, he developed headaches, nausea, dizziness. So did his team. He noted compasses spinning wildly, watches stopping. 2 members of the team were evacuated with severe symptoms. What Kulik, decades before the term existed, called radiation sickness. He sent the fragments to Moscow for study. Then the orders came. Stop collecting. Focus only on the forest damage. Avoid speculating about the object's nature. His samples were confiscated. His observations buried. "We are ordered to leave," Kulik wrote. "The samples are gone. Whatever fell here, Moscow does not want us to know." His final entry was chilling in its clarity. Science loses to politics. Truth is buried in the forest. For almost 100 years, no one knew of this second journal. Then, in 2023, researchers at Moscow State University uncovered a box in a restricted archive. It bore the label Kulik, Tunguska, 1927, classified. Inside, metallic fragments. When tested, they displayed isotopic ratios not found on Earth and signs of exposure to extreme pressure and heat. Not from any known weapon. Not from simple asteroid impact, possibly cometary, possibly artificial. The diary doesn't offer a conclusion. Kulik didn't claim alien origin, nor did he write of conspiracy, only of anomalies, of data that couldn't be explained and was therefore suppressed. The mystery of Tunguska remains, but the diary adds a human dimension. Kulik didn't just record what he saw, he felt the weight of being silenced, of watching evidence be taken, questions go unanswered. And yet he wrote it down anyway, perhaps knowing the world wouldn't read it in his lifetime, perhaps hoping that someone, someday, would open the sealed box and listen. Now we have. Whatever exploded above Siberia that day was real and strange and powerful. And thanks to a scientist who refused to let the truth vanish, we have more than scorched trees and broken theories. We have a voice, captured in pencil and paper, saying, "I saw this, and it matters." What if the man who navigated Amelia Earhart's final flight had already left behind the answer, and no one noticed? For decades, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart has hovered between myth and mystery, crashed at sea, captured, marooned. The world searched, guessed, and grieved. But the clue that might have solved it was misfiled for nearly 80 years. The navigation log of Fred Noonan. In 2014, as the Smithsonian Institution catalogued old aviation documents, a researcher opened a folder labeled Training Materials. Inside, scrawled in a hand known only to the most devoted historians, was Noonan's log from the final flight. Real-time calculations, adjustments, warnings. Each line was precise, technical. But as the pages unfolded, they painted a quiet drama of wind, drift, and fading fuel. Noonan had been fighting strong headwinds that pushed the plane off course. He tried to correct it. "Cannot maintain bearing," he wrote. "Fuel will not permit correction back." Then came the entry that changed everything. "If Howland not sighted by 9:45, will proceed to Phoenix Group." The Phoenix Group, a chain of islands. Among them, Nikumaroro. If Noonan's final fix was accurate, they may have passed within 30 miles of Nikumaroro. Not lost, but just off course. So close. And his words matched the last radio call from Earhart. "We are running north and south." They were searching, executing the backup plan. Years later, bones were found on Nikumaroro. Initially dismissed, later studies suggested they may have belonged to a woman of European descent, roughly Earhart's size. Fragments of American equipment were found. A compact mirror, bits of aircraft aluminum. But it was the log that brought it together. Not speculation, not rumor. Calculation. Noonan's contingency plan wasn't guesswork. It was deliberate. If they missed Howland, they had a second target. They flew toward it, and likely made it. The log also answers a haunting question. Why couldn't they find Howland despite being so close? The radio equipment failed. They could hear the Coast Guard. But the Coast Guard couldn't hear them. Their position was drifting. The ocean was vast. The island was tiny. In one line, Noonan scribbles what sounds like despair. Blind search. Cannot verify signal. In those last hours, they weren't panicking. They were problem-solving, running patterns, stretching fuel, hoping. Fred Noonan's log is more than a record. It's a goodbye. Not written with grief, but with professionalism. A man doing his job to the last. He didn't leave a final message. No melodrama, just a series of numbers, bearing the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, would one day understand them. And now we do. They weren't lost in the vast unknown. They flew toward the only option left. They might have landed, might have survived for a while, but no help came, because no one knew where to look. Until now. The log sat in a drawer for decades, mislabeled, unread, waiting. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just misfiled, in the wrong folder, in the wrong cabinet, at the wrong time, until the day someone reads it and finally says, "This makes sense." And a mystery becomes a map, drawn in pencil, leading back to where history made a wrong turn. What if history's greatest act of mass escape wasn't a myth, but a quiet, temporary victory? Alcatraz was never supposed to fail. Perched on a rocky island in the San Francisco Bay, surrounded by freezing currents and patrolled waters, it was designed to be inescapable. And yet, on June 11th, 1962, 3 inmates vanished into the night. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. The official story: they drowned. Their raft sank. The currents pulled them under. No bodies were ever recovered, but the government declared them dead. The myth was sealed until 2013. That year, a crumpled piece of synthetic fabric, once part of a makeshift raft, washed up on Angel Island. Inside, sealed against decades of tide and salt, was a waterproof pouch. In it, a journal. The pages were warped, water-stained, but readable. The handwriting was matched to Frank Morris, the mastermind of the escape. The first entry, dated June 12, 1962, "We made it to land. Not sure how. Clarence is shaking badly. He won't go on." Morris described hiding in the brush, drying out the raft. Clarence stayed behind, too weak to move. Frank and John pushed forward, swimming to the marine shore. They didn't just survive, they planned. The journal detailed their journey north. They stole clothing from a barn, a car from a farmhouse near Healdsburg. They drove at night, resting in the day. John was injured. Cracked ribs from the swim or the escape. "We'll reach Seattle by the 20th, Morris wrote. "We'll find a way across. Clarence, if you're alive, stay hidden. We'll come back." But they never did. That final entry fades mid-sentence. A rainstorm, maybe, or the writer's own failing strength. The raft was real. The journal was real. And it told the story officials refused to believe. They made it off the island, onto the mainland, and disappeared. At least for a while. Later, witnesses surfaced. A farmer recalled his father reporting a missing car and tools in June 1962. A woman remembered seeing 2 strange men walking down Highway 101, one limping, wrapped in a stolen coat. And then came the card. A Christmas card, received by the Anglin family in 2013. Postmarked from South America, signed with just one name: John. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive, but the journal made it plausible. The government didn't reopen the case. Officially, the escapees are presumed dead, but the U.S. Marshals still carry their files, just in case. The story doesn't end with a grand reunion or a conclusive arrest. It ends in ambiguity, a possibility etched in salt-stained paper. But that's what makes it powerful. Because for 3 men who had been counted out, defined by concrete and bars, survival itself was enough. Frank Morris didn't write for fame. He wrote because he knew no one would believe them otherwise. He wrote to say, "We did what they said couldn't be done." And though time may have erased the trail, For a few days in June 1962, three men didn't just escape prison. They escaped certainty, and for the rest of their lives, or however long they had, they lived free. Ghosts walking in the world that had already buried them. What if the truth was never lost, just waiting to be read? Across oceans, across decades, across continents and ideologies, 10 diaries emerged like messages in bottles, carried by time, forgotten by systems, preserved by chance. Each one written not in triumph, but in desperation. Not to declare victory, but to whisper, "This matters." From the freezing decks of the Franklin expedition to the silent jungle of Jonestown, these diaries told stories that official records would not, or could not. They filled in the missing sentences of history, not with spectacle, but with humanity. They did not offer closure, they offered understanding, because each one was written by someone who knew they would not be heard in their lifetime. They wrote anyway, they wrote as the ice closed in, as poison filled the air, as footsteps retreated from execution rooms. They wrote from hiding, from pain, from the edge of discovery. They wrote knowing the pages might be burned, buried, misfiled, lost to war, or rot, or apathy. And yet, somehow, they were not. They surfaced, decades later, not as proof of conspiracies or final answers, but as something more enduring. Witness. They showed us the moment when myth touches reality, when the unknowable becomes a name, when a missing plane becomes a logbook, when a faceless killer becomes a trembling hand on paper. And what of the diaries that haven't been found? What stories still rest inside forgotten walls, unmarked boxes, sealed pockets stitched into old clothing? What truths are waiting to be heard? Not because they change everything, but because they change someone. History is incomplete. It is built on what survives and what doesn't. For every official account, there is a shadow in the margins, a perspective unspoken, a sentence left in the dark. These diaries remind us that time does not erase truth, it only hides it. And that truth, once uncovered, does not shout. It waits, quietly, patiently, for someone to listen. Because in the end, history is not made only by the powerful or the victorious. It is made by those who dared to write it down, not knowing if anyone ever would care. They were not trying to be remembered. They were trying not to be forgotten. And now, at last, they are not.